Hello, and welcome to this installment of our RSA Conference webcast series sponsored by Varonis. Our topic today is hackers' rights. I'm your host, Casey Zirkis, content strategist for the RSA Conference team. During the webcast, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Our guests will be taking questions throughout the session, so if you do have a question for them, please submit it through the Q&A feature, which you can find down below in the options bar. As a reminder, this webcast is being recorded. Following the webcast, you will receive an email containing the link to the video replay. The replay will also be posted to rsaconference.com. I would now like to ask our guests to introduce themselves so that we can get started. Harley, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Harley Geiger, and I am Director of Public Policy at Rapid7. We're a cybersecurity company, and I run our public policy and government affairs activities. I'm a lawyer and a previous Hill staffer. Done a lot of stuff. That's the short version. Am I supposed to go on?
No, we can go to Chloe. Thanks, Harley.
Thanks, Harley. That was awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Mistagi, and I'm the VP of Strategy over at Point3 Security. And when I'm not doing that, I am the co-founder of WOSEC, which is Women of Security, and also the founder of We Are Hackers, formerly known as Women Hackers, and also the co-founder is Hacking is Not a Crime. Thanks for having me again.
Hey, and I'm Bo Woods. I am a cyber safety advocate with I Am the Cavalry Initiative. I'm a cyber safety innovation fellow over at the Atlantic Council think tank, founder of Strategos Security, and I sit on the board of quite a few nonprofits.
Wonderful. Harley, Chloe, Bo, thank you all so much for joining us today. Let's jump right in with trying to clarify terms and the behaviors associated with friendly hackers versus adversaries. So what are friendly hackers, and what are some examples of positive outcomes from friendly hackers or cybersecurity researchers? Bo, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I've got a framework that I use to describe this, especially when I'm talking to people in the public policy field or elsewhere where they don't deal every day with, people with red mohawks and such. And I say that there's 5 motivations of the cybersecurity research community or of the friendly hackers. The first one is protector. They want to defend people, organizations. So they'll look for issues so that they can get them fixed as quickly as possible. The second is puzzlers. These are people who are just curious. They tinker, they pull things apart and put them back together the best they can. And these people just want to find, explore, discover new things. Then you've got people who are doing it for pride and prestige. You've got some people who want to be the best at what they do. And those people really drive the industry forward. They drive the community forward to discover ever more complex vulnerabilities and ever more complex fixes for those vulnerabilities. Then there's the profit motive, which is what most people are familiar with. People who are penetration testers or who do bug bounties at night. They may be, saving up extra to send their kids to better school or to get a better house to move to in a better school district. And then finally, there's the patriot or protest. These are people ideologically motivated. These are folks who may go into the military because they want to serve their country, or they may try and take down, Syrian government malware that's compromising journalists so that they can kind of keep the freedom of the speech, freedom of press going as a global concern. So that's how I kind of think about the white hat security community.
So when I explain sort of the difference between hackers that are hacking for good and malicious actors, the way that I describe it is that these are people who are testing digital products or software for vulnerabilities for the purpose of mitigating those vulnerabilities, either with a patch or just to spread greater awareness about a vulnerability so that users can avoid it. So this is hacking that is beneficial to society and to consumer protection, and it's an activity and a skill set that we should be encouraging. as opposed to hacking that is done for theft of money or intellectual property damage or harassment, right? So very different motivations and very different effect on society. You asked what a couple of examples were, and I did some thinking about that. And I had a couple of examples, just a relatively recent, that I thought had independent research that had a high impact on the ecosystem, on the ecosystem security. And I'll talk about two. One is Google Project Zero, discovering the vulnerability not that long ago in iPhones that would let attackers remotely take control over iPhones. I believe that has been patched, and we are all more secure for that disclosure, for that research. A second is research from Secura that found a vulnerability in NetLogon that would enable attackers to seize domain admin powers if they can communicate with the domain controller. So this is the zero logon vulnerability. It was one of the more sophisticated and significant vulnerabilities that we've seen out of Microsoft since Eternal Blue. And again, we are more safe now for having known about this vulnerability. So again, bottom line, this is for the purpose of greater security, greater awareness, and it's something that should be encouraged.
I would definitely say that Arlie and Bo just knocked it out of the park. So this makes the rest of my comments just very short and brief. I try to let people know that the difference between attackers and hackers is that they use the same skill set. It's just for a different intent. What is their objective? And by trying to ask the question, why are they doing this? It gives us a better idea of who are these individuals. Hackers, they're doing it to serve and protect, also out of curiosity. But overall, their goal is to protect you from attackers. And attackers, their goal is for their own intent, for malicious intent. And so it's important to understand that they use the same skill set, but for very, very different reasons. And because of that, these two parties are very different from each other.
Yeah. And I think that, I really appreciate the way that, Bo, that you broke that down. And then, Chloe, I think you echoed some of what he had said, but the examples, Harley, that you used to really elucidate that, this is the intent, as you said, Chloe, is really for the betterment of society and the security of an organization and all the ripple effects of that. So as a follow-up to that, I'd love if each of you could talk a little bit about what motivates friendly hackers. Bo, you touched on this for sure, and Chloe a little bit. But obviously adversaries are making a lot of money, right? So if they're using that same skill set, what motivates someone to be an ally rather than an adversary?
Yeah, I think there's many different things that could cause somebody to go one route with their life rather than another. And I think that quite a bit of it seems to depend on socio-political conditions, right? If you're in a place where, maybe you're in a place where the median income per month is $200 or $300, even for people who have a job, and you don't, and your family doesn't, but you're located in a part of the world that has a really high quality education system. So you're smart, you've got a family to feed, and you may know computers fairly well. That'll drive some people to do things that may be unacceptable to the rest of the population, or particularly to the victim population. And so we see that quite a lot of the adversaries are located in places like that have low socioeconomic conditions. That's one of the causes and one of the differences and distinctions I see between the friendly hackers and the adversaries. Now, that doesn't mean if you're from a lower socioeconomic condition, you're going to be an adversary, because there's plenty of people who aren't. I know tons of folks who are from those same areas who don't turn to crime, who are out there trying to find ways to positively contribute. But when those positive contributions might be cut off, say there's no coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy, or there's no way to get hired as a security researcher or a penetration tester, then it leaves many fewer avenues for them to make money to help themselves and their families.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on basically what was shared. But the thing I would definitely say is that we have to also look at a perspective of if you provide more of a legal pathway for, for those that are doing things that are not quite quote unquote ethical hacking, I think you would see a lot more of them trying to serve and protect. The thing is that as was shared earlier, socioeconomic or sociopolitical reasons is something that really does play a role this year. There are definitely hackers out there that basically they're trying to serve and protect, because what's happening is we've seen an increase of, I think, 400% increase of breaches this year. And a lot of it has to do with hospitals, especially with COVID-19, ransomware as well. And so it's really important to understand that suddenly there's like this call of duty happening this year where a bunch of hackers in the community have stepped up and volunteered, doing pro bono work to try to protect these organizations, so then we can get treatments, so we can make sure that every single person right now around the world is not having to worry about security, but focus on their families or themselves when it comes to their health and their future prospects. But it's also a time where it's very, very easy for the quote unquote bad guys to do something terrible. For example, you'll also see that right now it's like a dream come true for attackers that are trying to phish, because now they don't have to research on what are items that make you tick or a passion or anything like that, because everyone's passion right now is COVID-19 or the election. And so this year has definitely provided quite an opportunity for attackers to get into systems by pretending to do something with COVID-19 or the election itself. And so it's really important to understand is why are they doing it, and asking what is going on here. And I think it has a lot to do with the conscious. I think a lot of hackers in the community, they may have done something wrong at some point, but they felt guilty, and then they proceeded to stop doing what they were doing previously to do something good. So I think consciousness plays a huge role also for hackers, because they're trying to protect people, because we've all know someone or even ourselves have been, impacted at some point because of some compromise or whatnot.
I think that's between this, what you all just said, and then the last question, I think that was a great examination of motivations. I'd only add a little bit to it. That was a very empathetic reading of the adversaries. There are, of course, also nation states out there and criminal gangs who, if you ransomware a hospital full of COVID-19 patients, I don't have a ton of empathy for you. For the researchers, we also need to remember there are, I think Bo touched on this, there are accidental researchers. I mean, there are folks who are not setting out to try to find a vulnerability, but they find one just through their normal use of a product. They happen upon something, and suddenly they have a vulnerability, and they have to figure out a way to communicate that to the manufacturer, or sit on it, or do what with it. And that is where the law and the chilling effect comes into play, the hacker's rights.
I have to admit that the former English teacher in me is loving this conversation, and is Bo's, talking about, the disenfranchised, and I want to call you like the Victor Hugo of the hacker community, because you're eliciting that same sort of empathy for, right, in lame as we see that empathy for, the choices that we have to make because of our circumstances. So I appreciate that human element that you draw upon there. Chloe, let's start with you this time, and then Bo and Harley, please chime in with your own thoughts as well. Can you explain how the hacker community keeps organizations safer, and why it's important to have disclosure? Additionally, part 3 of that question, what are the consequences of not having disclosure?
I love this question, because this is that question that highlights why you need hackers and why you need to work with hackers. We need a bilateral trust between organizations and hackers. And the thing to note about it is that when hackers come across a vulnerability, about 1 out of 4 will report that vulnerability. But usually when they do report that vulnerability itself, it's either ignored or it is, let's just say, misinterpreted And this could also end them having a lawsuit delivered to their door, saying that they broke the CFA, the Computer Fraud Abuse Act. The thing to note is that the reason why they reported and took a huge chance to report the vulnerability to you is because they may actually be a consumer themselves of the product, or it could just be because they want to make sure that their users are safe and they want to help the company out and be like, hey, you have this vulnerability. If an attacker finds this, they can take huge advantage of you and your consumers. And I'm just bringing this to the forefront for you to understand. The unfortunate bit, though, is that when you don't have disclosure policies, that 1 out of 4 hackers that do find it will report it. And when they do report it, it's usually through social media channels because they can't find who to contact. So this becomes a huge problem itself because sometimes you'll be spending hours, days, and weeks to try to find who is the point of contact to report this vulnerability so it gets fixed, which you already feel like you are taking a huge step as it is to report the vulnerability because you're worried about being prosecuted regardless. And the thing to understand is that when you do message on social media, the problem is that most of the time the people that are running that is marketing teams. And marketing teams, sometimes they're not connected at all with security or the IT groups at their company. And so what ends up happening is they will ignore it or they'll just send it over to like someone else in the department who doesn't understand what the hacker is trying to do in the first place because of this fear that the public has of the hacker community. We have these socially constructed beliefs that hackers are devious people because we haven't seen a separation in what the media reports about hackers versus attackers. And this is one of the reasons why we still don't have vulnerability disclosures is because of these beliefs that the population has of our community. And we're hoping to change that because when you change that, that helps a lot. But CISA itself and also other government agencies right now have been pushing for vulnerability disclosure policies to be in place across the US. And this is a huge step forward because they understand that to have a good cybersecurity plan and strategy is to also have disclosure policies. So then hackers can report something so they could be ahead of the game when it comes to attackers trying to find something. That would be like pretty much a whole summary of why vulnerability disclosure is so important because the consequences are dire. I have had friends basically reach out saying, hey, I found this vulnerability. I reported it to them, but they're ignoring me. And then I kid you not, about a few weeks later or a couple months later, they end up having a huge breach and it's all over in the news. And you don't want to be that organization because once you lose the trust of your consumers, you may not have a company sometimes, or you might actually lose product, you will lose revenue. So it's really important to work with hackers because their reason they're in it is to help and protect you and your consumers.
Yeah, I think if I can tell a very brief story, in 2010, 2011, some security researchers were looking at the security of medical devices, insulin pumps, and other implanted or direct delivery medical devices. And initially at that time, when they reported their findings, the manufacturers said, like, we don't really want to hear about it. Don't tell us how to do our jobs. We know safety really well. And they were right. They did know safety really well, but they weren't connecting cybersecurity to safety. They weren't building that into their engineering at the mindset and the research and development phase like they would have to actually protect against some of these types of attacks the researchers had demonstrated. So the FDA, playing their role as regulator, sitting back and watching this happen, said, we understand that there have never been cases, or we can't find any cases where someone has died from getting hacked. But we would be not doing our jobs very well if we didn't investigate this, if we didn't look deeper. And so over the course of the past decade or so, the FDA and medical device makers, hospitals, caregivers, patients, everybody has come to understand cybersecurity is actually integral to safety and effectiveness of medical devices. And that's a case where security researchers, friendly hackers, started that initiative, started that ball rolling, got the attention, had to go and do it at big events, big public events, because the community wasn't listening, the healthcare community wasn't listening at that time. And since then, there's been a sea change, an absolute, practically overnight for healthcare in a decade, change about the way that healthcare providers, medical device makers look at cybersecurity and see it as actually an engineering thing that leads to safety and effectiveness. So I think that that's the type of value to society that hackers can bring when there's collaboration, when there's understanding, when there's a little bit of empathy. Yes, I do like empathy, and I don't mind being called the Victor Hugo of cybersecurity. When we have those conditions, when we get people together to have these discussions, to realize that we're all pointing in the same direction, we all want the same things, that it can really unlock hackers as a resource rather than a threat.
So I would add just a little bit to it. I thought on the importance of having a vulnerability disclosure policy. So first of all, the work that Bo has done and others in the community have done to spread this concept has been really remarkable. Just even in the past 5 years, let alone the past 10 years. We're at a point now where all government agencies, all federal government agencies are going to be required to have a vulnerability disclosure policy, as Chloe mentioned. Just in the past week, this week, there was a bill that was signed into law that is also going to require government contractors of information systems to the government to also have vulnerability disclosure policies. So it is spreading. It's in the NIST cybersecurity framework, certain other standards. It is becoming more recognized as an important cybersecurity practice, and with good reason. Chloe mentioned a whole lot of reasons why it's really important to have a vulnerability disclosure policy. I only want to add a couple more. One is to set expectations on both sides. And for an organization that may be receiving vulnerabilities from researchers, you can also and should use your vulnerability disclosure policy to set certain expectations on how that research can be received. So you have a dedicated channel going to the right people who can actually do something about it, rather than to the marketing department, or to the social media department. There's also there can be confusion that leads to more of an adversarial relationship if the concept of money is involved, right? So if the researcher decides, well, I'll give this to you for $10 for 10 cheeseburgers, then it starts to look a little bit more like we're getting into the realm of extortion, and maybe the researcher doesn't intend that. They really just want 10 cheeseburgers. And but if your vulnerability disclosure policy sets out in advance that this is not for compensation, then you can help avoid that, set expectations from the very beginning, and help establish like a mutual trust between the researcher and the organization.
Awesome. So shifting gears a little bit, I would love if each of you could maybe share with today's audience some cases that you're familiar with in which the hacker community dealing with organizational threats, the hacker community is dealing with organizational threats because they are being perceived as the threat when they're actually doing the work of disclosing.
I got one. There's a number of examples, but this is one that I like. It relates to a researcher named Kevin Finisterre and his research on drones. So there is a major drone manufacturer based in China, DJI is its name. DJI had a bug bounty program for its drones, and the authorization that it had in its bug bounty program also included DJI servers. And so DJI wanted this disclosure for bugs, but the scope was a little ambiguous. It did mention servers. Well, so Kevin Finisterre confirmed via email, does the bug bounty cover not just the drone software, but also DJI servers? Yes, it does. And so Kevin disclosed to DJI that their AWS buckets were marked public with no permissions, and that exposed customer data, including government IDs, flight logs, photos, and other things that were not supposed to be public. And DJI proceeded to argue that, no, we didn't mean those servers. Our AWS buckets were off limits, and they sent a letter noting that they were reserving their options under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And so Kevin actually wrote up a very detailed account of the whole affair, walked away from the bug bounty. And that detailed account is I think makes this stand out. It's a bit unusual and very thorough in its documentation of the different steps and the how it all worked out. Ultimately, DJI did not pursue a claim, and nor should they. I think that they would not have a good case. But it was illustrative of the reaction that researchers sometimes face when they're disclosing vulnerabilities, particularly in ways that the organization does not expect.
That's my favorite case. Whenever I'm talking about hacker rights, like, you have to hear about this DJI case. It's like my favorite one because it really does paint a picture of like what happens when someone's even making sure it's in scope, making sure it's right, and on. There was this case earlier this year. I won't mention the company, but basically this company has an app that would use with this marginalized population that are normally victims of like cyber stalking and whatnot. And basically this application, it would take in biometric data, and there was a vulnerability where basically someone could get access into their entire records, the names, the phone numbers, their location of the users, along with their biometrics, so they could use it for their own gain. And so two researchers, they sent a DM on social media, on Twitter to be exact, and they came back saying, they messaged them saying, hey, we found a vulnerability that's really important for you to fix. Can we get in touch with you so we can share, or can you point us in the right direction? No word. So then they tweeted out to the organization saying, hey, we found something, can you please contact us? And then next thing they know is that they get a DM back threatening them for trying to push out information about the vulnerability, and that they're trying to extort them for money. And then their other PR folks in that company itself started tweeting out things that were incorrect about these two researchers, saying like that they were a part of all these sleazy kind of events and whatnot, which none of this stuff was true at all. Just started trying to basically wipe them on social media, calling them as these terrible actors and whatnot, when all they were trying to do is just like, hey, we found this vulnerability, it's really important for you to fix, because all these users of yours have very sensitive data on here. And they received a lawsuit, a third of the lawsuit connected to the CFA. And they got to a point where like, well, what are we going to do? And what they do is sometimes in these cases, they publish all the messaging and content and whatnot online, sharing what happened, all the steps that followed up with it. They did, the organization itself took back the lawsuit, didn't issue an apology or anything, but the two researchers themselves are still pretty, they knew like this was a possibility. They just didn't know that they would come after and do character attacks of the researchers, when all they just did was just send them a DM saying, hey, we found something that you may want to know about.
So we do have a question from the audience here. Ron is asking, what are your thoughts about the coal fire security testers being jailed in Iowa during their testing earlier this year? And do you have recommendations for both testing companies and their clients to prevent situations like this from happening in the future?
Yeah, I can grab that one first. So for folks not aware of the issue, I'll give you a very brief background. There's a coal fire. They were doing some on-site penetration testing, basically trying to get into buildings at the request of the Iowa government. Because of some kind of a jurisdictional dispute between the government and the building owner and the occupants, the coal fire testers were arrested. And the question was, did the contract allow them to be able to do that testing? Was there any laws that they violated? And eventually they have been set free. All the charges were dropped. But it took appeals to some pretty powerful people in the state to have that happen. I would like to think that this is a case of some kind of a bureaucratic breakdown and not malicious intent on the part of any organization or individual. Certainly, this is something that's kind of routine for penetration testers to do, is to go on site and try and get access, because that's one of the ways that criminals get into places to steal sensitive information or compromise environments. So Coalfire, I believe, came out and published some of their guidance or guidelines for other companies to avoid getting caught in the same type of thing. We call it, in the industry, we call it a get out of jail card. And they published one that's been vetted by a bunch of their lawyers. I think Trusted Sec also published something similar. So those are some things you can pretty easily grab and drop in. But you know, it's one of those things where security researchers, in a lot of cases, can be afraid just doing their jobs that they might get rolled up by law enforcement, and that's why things like reforming the CFAA and DMCA exemptions are so critical to ensuring that the people who are just trying to make the world a better place, just trying to make a world a safer place, and staying within the intent and bounds of the law, are not inadvertently captured in law enforcement.
There's also oh, sorry. I was just going to say.
No, it's okay. I just think he was breaking up a little bit. I didn't know if he wanted to read. But go ahead, Chloe.
Yeah, Coalfire has started an initiative called Protecting Ethical Hackers. You can find on their website. Because of what happened to their employees, they're trying to take legislative action. And there's a good number of us in the community that has partnered up with them to try to change about local legislation when it comes to hackers when they're trying to do their job and whatnot, and to change the mindset that the population has of us.
So I think those are excellent summaries. I do think that this is like a local government jurisdictional battle, and they used pen testers sort of as I don't want to say hostages, but they use them to ratchet up the tension in this jurisdictional battle. And I think I think that it would be very difficult for them to actually prosecute them successfully under both state and federal law, because they were acting within the scope of their contract. You know, if the two government agencies want to argue about whether the contract is valid, that's independent of the penetration testers, you know, having authorization from the contracting entity. And you're sort of seeing a pattern here. Like I think DJI didn't have a great case. In the unnamed company that Chloe described earlier, I don't think that they have a great case. I don't think that, you know, the case against the Coalfire pen testers is great. But the fact that these laws are there and they're broad enough to, you know, ostensibly cover hacking activity does lead to this chilling effect, and it does lead to lawsuits. There's very little incentive, you know, or blowback for filing a bad lawsuit, and there's certainly none for sending a letter threatening to do so. And you know, these are the sorts of vehicles that we see most often that are used against researchers, and they use laws like the CFA, like the DMCA, and state equivalents as a hook.
So I do want to get to that discussion of the CFAA and DMCA with you, Harley, but I want to throw in a question from the audience, just because in my mind it makes sense right now. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit so we're not naming and shaming, but when we see big high profile breaches like we've seen this week, do you see that has an impact on the industry and the way that people view hackers? Do you think that the media has an impact on that, positive versus negative, and that fight that you're trying to fight to get the good reputation?
I'll take the first part if you guys want. On the image. Okay. So in general, the thing is, there's these things, I always talk about them in cognitive science, we call it socially constructed beliefs. These are beliefs that you have basically picked up in your lifetime through movies, through books, through conversations. And these could be wrong. A lot of times they can be wrong. And the problem is that most of the time when the media talks about hackers versus attackers, the thing is they don't understand that there's two very different parties. And this is the thing that happens, is that you'll see them use the term hackers when they should be using the term attackers because it was a malicious activity. And they'll use imagery of a hooded figure in a basement, usually a white male. And this is a huge problem because we're still fighting against that. I know every time that I tell people I work in the hacker community, they take a step back and they try to get out of a conversation, or they just like look at me like, oh, you're a criminal? Why would you tell me this? And it's really fascinating to watch that. But it's these socially constructed beliefs that the media keeps putting out there, but they just don't know better most of the time. So letting them know that there's a difference between the two parties plays a huge role right now, because reports are all about reporting accuracy. And so by letting them know what is the accurate terms we use, that would help us a lot.
Yeah. So the story goes, in 1984, after Ronald Reagan had watched war games, he was in a high-level meeting with some of his generals, and he kept getting distracted by this thought. So he eventually turned to one of the generals and says, "General, tell me that what happened in war games couldn't happen to us in real life." General said, "Sir, Mr. President, I'll go find out for you." So he runs off to the Pentagon, comes back a few days later, says, "Mr. President, it's worse than you can possibly imagine." And that was the impetus for the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, in its original form. Who knows if that's actually the story that happened, but that's what gets passed down to us through legend. And it just goes to show the impact that media and media perceptions of hackers can have on what we do and how we do it. The Hewlett Foundation has undertaken a project to kind of see if they can generate better, more positive, more accurate portrayals of hackers in media and film. And they did a project with OpenIDEO a couple of years ago, where they tried to generate some new stock art, some new memeable images that people could use instead of just the person in the ski mask with their fingers on the keyboard or whatever. And I think that's a good effort, but right now the zeitgeist, the popular opinion is that hackers are criminals, and I think that folks like Chloe, like Harley, like myself, and a bunch of the other people in our community are trying to change that, trying to show the positive examples of what hackers can do when they're not treated as criminals, when they're actually welcomed or allowed to do what they're really, really good at, and when that's seen as, again, a resource rather than a threat.
I agree with all of that. I want to touch just really briefly on the media's perception of the FireEye attack. I think that for different audiences, they're going to perceive it differently, and it's not this type of stuff is not necessarily really accessible to a lay audience, a very broad audience. I will say that some of the articles that I have read about it, I think, are being relatively even-handed. And I thought that FireEye seemed to, it's still early, but they seem to do a pretty good job of, putting out tools so that people can defend themselves and being transparent on their blog posts about what happened. And if what happened did happen, what is being talked about did happen, then I thought that the media is being relatively even-handed. This appears to be a nightmare of an attack, right? A nation state using very sophisticated, very bespoke tools to attack a cybersecurity company. And that's very, very difficult to defend against. I mean, the cybersecurity industry has been saying forever, there's no such thing as perfect security. And we meant it, right? And so I'll say the media, I think, is doing a good job of that. How much of that really translates to broad audiences, I'm not sure. And there may just be a perception, well, hackers are criminals, and oh my gosh, all their tools are loose now, and and it'll just be more outrage. I hope not. And if we see that, I think that we as a community should try to speak out against it.
Well, it is funny. I'm recalling back in October around Halloween, one of my little 9-year-old neighbors was running around with his anonymous mask on. And he was running through the streets, and he came up to me and he lifted his mask up and he said, "I'm a hacker." And I said, "No, you're an attacker." So he was trying to scare me. He was like screaming, and yeah. Anyway, Harley, can you talk a little bit more about some of the legal barriers for security researchers, and maybe explain the difference between the CFAA and DMCA and any other laws researchers should be paying attention to?
They should pay attention to all the laws, just like all of us good citizens should. So there are several. There are several laws that constrain security research. I'll just touch on a couple of the major ones. So the CFA and DMCA, as well as state laws. And I think it's worth noting, here that researchers need to watch out for both government prosecutors and private lawsuits. Government action gets all the attention, like when there's big attention around any sort of arrest or criminal proceeding. But in our experience, private lawsuits from private actors are by far the bigger threat. There's more of them than criminal actions, and they tend to be more edge cases. I think researchers are much more at threat from the private lawsuit side. So the CFA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, in general, when we're talking about the CFAA, we're talking about other people's computers, right? So things that you do to other people's computers. It forbids damaging other people's computers, so like DDoS attacks, putting malware on them, trafficking in other people's passwords, accessing somebody's computer without authorization, and then exceeding authorized access. So that's the weird one, and the one that trips up researchers most of all. So that is where you have authorization to do something to somebody else's computer, whether it's for work or on the public library, but you don't have authorization to do anything you want, right? So in terms of service, you go to the library and it says, by using this computer, you agree to to not perform security research on the computer, but you have authorization to search the card catalog. That is where it gets ambiguous because of what does authorization mean in this context, and really should we be criminalizing a violation of terms of service? And that actually is the subject right now of a Supreme Court case. And I can totally nerd out about that for the remainder of our time, but I won't. I will move on to the DMCA. So the DMCA is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. You've probably heard about it in other contexts, to like notice and takedown and stuff, but we're not talking about any of that. This is about a small part of the DMCA, but it directly affects security researchers. And this is Section 1201. In Section 1201 of the DMCA, it's not a very snappy name, but in Section 1201, you are forbidden from circumventing, means getting around, the technological protection measure to software. Now, where CFAA was for other people's computers, this affects devices that you yourself own. And it was supposed to be a copyright protection measure. So software has a copyright, and we didn't want piracy, and so we forbade getting around things like poor encryption or bad logons or bad login credentials, things like that, to unlock the software to examine it for security research. And so again, that applies to devices that you yourself own. There is a complicated exemption process, which I know is, again, can nerd out about it. That is actually the cutting edge, believe it or not, of security researcher law happening right there. In this very weird, niche area of copyright, the most articulate description of a safe harbor for security researchers is happening there. And it's actually happening right now, believe it or not, because it renews every 3 years. The last thing I'll say is states. So we complain a lot about the CFAA in particular and DMCA. States are worse. States are actually far worse. We think that the CFAA is vague, has that exceeds authorized access problem that I'm talking about. If you take a look at state computer crime laws, they borrow some of the same language as CFA, access without authorization exceeds authorized access, and many of them go several steps further, and there's actually more ambiguity there. Almost every state has a computer crime law as sort of the equivalent of CFAA. You can be prosecuted under the state law just as easily, perhaps more so, than under CFAA. So I would absolutely watch out for that. That is not the entirety of the laws that are out there, but those are a few.
Yeah, and that's in the U.S. Of course, internationally, there's other laws per country, and even in some trade deals. I know Harley's worked on some of that to look at international laws and international treaties where they instantiate some of the same language.
On the international stuff, there was a law that was proposed by China. There were two different regulations proposed by China, but one in particular had bearing on researchers, which was it forbade disclosing a vulnerability publicly unless the manufacturer, unless the organization, the software developer, or whatever, had issued a preventative measure first. And so if the company is out of business or is just not responsive and they don't issue the preventative measure, really the researcher's only opportunity then is to turn to the Chinese government and to disclose the vulnerability to them. And the penalty for violating that were pretty harsh. It included jail time. I don't believe that. I don't know whether or not that has been implemented yet, but it's been proposed. So these are out there, and this is something that I think governments around the world are struggling with. And I want to say, it is actually important that we do have laws like this, right? I mean, I don't want to just dunk on the CFAA. I do think that the CFAA serves a valid policy purpose in society. Like, we need a law that prevents cybercrime. There are certain things that attackers do that are not really covered well by other laws. And we don't want to twist other laws, in weird ways to cover things like DDoS, for example. These things should be constrained. What we need to do is now that we're 20 years, 30 years out from the CFAA, we need to look at how it applies to modern practice and try to reform it, not just cancel it.
And I'll throw this out there now, a question from the audience, just because we touched on international stuff, but Richard is asking, how are international export controls impacting researchers in Europe nowadays?
That is a very specific question. Bo, I heard you taking breath. Do you have a specific answer?
No, I assume that this is about Wassenaar, and I don't know if you've kept track of Wassenaar at all.
I didn't even dare say that, so thank you for pronouncing it correctly, Bo.
Well, that's good news. So the reason that I hesitated was because there are separate export controls, that the EU has, that the United States has. The Wassenaar arrangement is a set of export controls that a bunch of nations have come together on, and thankfully, there has been a lot of progress made on carving out vulnerability disclosure from the Wassenaar controls. And a lot of credit to the security community, to Katie Masoris, Microsoft, VMware, others that really stepped up to bat to work with negotiators to make that happen. In the United States, that language hasn't been implemented, so it's not actually the law of the land yet. I'm not aware of its status in Europe, but the way that it works is that you have the Wassenaar arrangement, which is a kind of high-level language that everybody is supposed to write their own in-country regulation, and is supposed to be consistent with the Wassenaar arrangement. We haven't done that second step yet. Whether or not Europe has, again, I don't know. But if they are following the Wassenaar arrangement, there should be protections for vulnerability disclosure there. And it's another success story of how vulnerability disclosure is making its way into laws, and there is a greater recognition that this is important.
Great, thanks for that. So going back to these laws that you mentioned, what are the chances of reforming those laws, and what would reform even look like? And then Linda is on the same page here with this third part of the question. In the absence of legal, what else can the security community do to protect itself and show that hacking is not a crime?
Well, the first things first, we need to update these really out-of-date laws, as Harley has shared with you. You should also check out Aaron's Law, because that's a good way forward, in my opinion. Of course, we could always do more than just that. But I would say the one thing for sure is that the CFA needs to be updated. It didn't have any representation of the hacker community. And this is always a problem with legislation, is when you don't have those parties that are not represented, that it's going to impact them, that becomes a problem. Yes, we do need the CFA to exist to a certain extent to protect us from cyber attacks and to make sure that prosecution can happen to attackers. But we also need to make sure that we're protecting our hackers. So for it to not be misused and using it to prosecute them, or having something so vague that it's even more easier to prosecute. And also we need to look at the redundancies that are possible to do with the CFA. But the one thing first is we need to change public perception. And the only way that we can do that is if we work with organizations, the media, and legislators. By talking to your legislators, it means a lot. We need to have a conversation with them, not telling them what to do, but learn a little bit about what are they passionate about and how does that help? How can we help them? And it always should be like that, not going to them and be like, this is the following reasons why you need to change everything. More like work with them, find out how can we help them as a hacker community? How can we help them out on the things that they're passionate about? Why hacker rights are needed to make sure that that can happen. The other thing you want to do is work with organizations, making sure they have vulnerability disclosure policies. That's so important right now more than ever. You got to have that bilateral trust there, a door open so then hackers can report things and know what's in scope, what's not in scope. So this also protects you as an organization to have one as well. And then to work with the media. The media is our friends. They let us know what's going on in the world, and to work with them in any sort of way possible for them to recognize that there's two separate parties. And I think that when you work with organizations, legislators, and also with the media, that's when we change public perception. That's when we challenge socially constructed beliefs. That's when we start challenging what is out there already in existence. But most importantly, we need people to understand who are hackers, because the only thing is that they don't know what we look like, and they're curious too. Humans are curious people. So seeing who we look like, why we went into this field, our issues that we're facing, that's something important. And right now, hacking is not a crime. We just launched an initiative called #HackerStories, where people upload 2 to 8 minute long videos about how they became a hacker, as well as the issues that they have faced since being a hacker. But it's really cool because you get to see their faces. And I think that's something the public has always wanted to know. What do we look like? And so that's the first things first, is to change the public perception of who we are so we can change legislation in the end.
So I agree with all of that. I think that vulnerability disclosure policies are something that companies can do right now to help advance this, protect themselves, strengthen security, and ensure that hackers can play a positive role outside of the traditional legal adversarial relationship that we see so often in the media. The way that reform looks legislatively, it will be different, right? So the three big areas that I mentioned, CFA, DMCA, and state laws, each one of those, it'll look slightly different because they cover different things. So for DMCA, like I said, that's the cutting edge of researchers' rights right there. And there is actually an exemption protecting security researchers. It is actually pretty good. The Copyright Office has put forth an exemption that will protect researchers under many circumstances, not all. Again, there are caveats, right? Like you can't steal a device and then expect that you will have protection in the DMCA if you research it. You have to lawfully acquire it. You have to be doing it for the purpose of security research, not for some other purpose. Like it has to be for the purpose of security. We don't want people to be hacking airplanes in the sky or live elections and all these other things that hackers are already being responsible about in general. So it will not just be I think a clean, safe harbor for all computers and for all types of research, but it will be one where they're trying to emphasize responsible behavior while still giving flexibility. That's sort of the balance that we're going for. For CFAA, unfortunately, that window of what is responsible and what enables cybersecurity is a bit smaller because again, there we're talking about other people's computers. I actually wrote Aaron's Law in 2013. I was the staffer that did it, and there were in fact hackers that were represented in the drafting of that. But there are a lot more. There are a lot more hackers now. There's a lot more understanding of what good faith hacking and research really is, and I think that you'll have a more receptive audience in Congress now. It wasn't so much that they were unrepresented; it was that it was sort of crushed by law enforcement and big business, and those same forces are still there now. The Supreme Court is ruling on a CFAA case. They will rule on it by June. And it covers this issue, which was part of Aaron's Law, this exceeds authorized access problem. And if the Supreme Court doesn't punt, like if they put out something that goes one way or the other on it, then I think that we will see a renewed interest in legislative reform because it's going to be detrimental to somebody. If they go with the government's theory, then violating terms of service can very well be a crime, and lying about your age on Facebook can be a crime. It can subject you to lawsuits. It's ridiculous. On the other hand, if they go the other way, then you have an insider threat problem. And so either way, I think that we'll see a legislative reform issue. Look for that by this summer. And until then, I would work on state laws and coordinated vulnerability disclosure.
Bo, did you have anything you wanted to add? Any final thoughts? With that, we quickly came to the top of the hour, so you've got a couple minutes if you want to chime in there.
Yeah, we did. This has been a very quick conversation, which I guess must mean we've been having fun.
Yeah.
No, I think Chloe and Harley did a great job of kind of walking through that. My only thought is that maybe, and I always like in the last couple of minutes to introduce something radical, but maybe we can start teaching hacking at retirement homes so that our parents and grandparents can be hackers and call themselves hackers. Teach them just the really simple stuff, right? This will also help them become defenders so that they can protect themselves. And then if somebody gets upset because, these hackers are doing things, it's like, well, yes, our grandparents are doing wonderful things over there, hacking to keep themselves safe.
I love it. And one of our listeners actually asked about the thoughts on educating children about hacking as well. So getting them from both ends, the young and the old, really will help to change and move the needle forward. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. Harley, Chloe, Bo, thank you so much. I know that many of these conversations started years ago and they are ongoing, which will hopefully result in some positive change for hackers. Thank you, each of you, for all that you do to keep our community safe. Listeners, thank you for joining in. Please keep the conversation going on your social channels using the hashtag RSAC.